My boss called my idea nonsense and said it had no right to exist. It wasn't the first time, but this time I was 100% confident in my idea. As it turned out, he was confident too. Now, in order. The moment it began, it didn't feel important. That's what bothers me most when I think back to it now. There was no revelation, no spark, no cinematic rush of certainty. I was alone in the office long after the others had left, the building humming softly like it was breathing in its sleep. My screen was crowded with open reports, error logs, timelines, cost summaries, information I had looked at dozens of times before without seeing anything new. Outside the windows, the city glowed dim and indifferent. Somewhere between my third cup of cold coffee and the ache in my shoulders, something shifted. I wasn't trying to invent anything. I was trying to understand why a process that looked efficient on paper kept bleeding money in practice. The numbers didn't lie, but they also didn't speak unless you asked the right questions. I started grouping the reports differently, layering timelines over expenditures, tracing recurring delays back to their source. What had always looked like unrelated problems began aligning into patterns. Not clean ones, not yet, but enough to make my pulse slow, my focus sharpen. I leaned closer to the screen, almost holding my breath. One inefficiency explained another. A delay here justified an overpayment there. Redundant approvals created artificial bottlenecks that forced emergency outsourcing, which cost 3 times more than internal solutions would have. No single report revealed it, but together they formed a map. And when I followed it to the end, I realized something uncomfortable and exhilarating at the same time. The system wasn't broken. It was poorly designed, and that meant it could be redesigned. The idea took shape quietly. If this step was removed, that role redefined, those resources reassigned before the delay instead of after it, everything changed. Costs dropped. Turnaround improved. Accountability sharpened. I ran the numbers again, convinced I had missed something obvious. I hadn't. I ran them a third time, then a fourth. Each time, the conclusion stayed the same. What we had been treating as unavoidable losses were actually predictable consequences of outdated thinking. I stood up without realizing it and began pacing, the soles of my shoes whispering against the carpet. My reflection stared back at me from the dark monitor beside my main screen. Tired eyes, tense jaw, hair pulled back too tightly. But behind the exhaustion, something unfamiliar flickered. Confidence. Not borrowed confidence, not the fragile kind that waits for validation, but the deep, steady sense that comes from understanding something thoroughly. I didn't think the idea was good. I knew it was. I opened a new document and began outlining it, not creatively, but structurally. Problem, cause, consequence, solution, projection, risk mitigation. Every section flowed into the next with a clarity that felt almost suspicious. This wasn't ambition speaking, it was logic. The more I wrote, the calmer I felt, as if I were finally aligning with something that had been waiting patiently to be noticed. By the time I saved the file, the office lights had dimmed automatically for the night. The timestamp glowed at the corner of the screen. I emailed nothing. I told no one. I sat there for a long moment, hands folded, aware that this idea could change how the company operated, and possibly how I was seen within it. That realization didn't thrill me as much as it should have. It grounded me instead. On the way home, the city felt different, sharper somehow. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement like scattered thoughts refusing to fade. I replayed the structure of the idea in my head, testing it from every angle, looking for cracks. There were none I couldn't explain or defend. For the first time in a long while, doubt didn't escort me to sleep. Something else did. A quiet certainty that tomorrow I would speak, and something irreversible would begin. I barely slept that night. Not because of anxiety, at least not the kind I was used to, but because my mind refused to let the idea rest. It kept rearranging itself, refining, strengthening. By morning, it felt solid, almost heavy, like something real I could place on the table. I arrived early again, dressed more carefully than usual, not out of vanity, but precision. If I was going to be taken seriously, I needed to remove every possible distraction. His office was at the end of the corridor, glass walls slightly frosted, just enough to suggest transparency without actually offering it. I stood outside for a moment, file tablet tucked under my arm, listening to the muffled sound of his voice on a call, calm, confident, occupying space. When he waved me in, he didn't look up right away. That should have been my first warning. "So," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, hands folded behind his head. "You said you had something." I nodded and began the way I had practiced, clearly, efficiently. I outlined the core problem first, then the patterns I'd discovered. I watched his face as I spoke, waiting for recognition, curiosity, even resistance. Instead, his expression remained oddly blank, like a closed door. I moved on to the solution, explaining the redesign, the cost projections, the long-term advantages. The more I spoke, the more animated I became, confidence slipping naturally into my voice. When I finished, there was silence. He glanced at the tablet briefly, barely scrolling. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "This?" he said, tapping the screen once. "This is what kept you here so late?" The words landed harder than I expected. "Yes," I replied carefully. "The numbers support it. If we implement even part of the structure—" He cut me off with a raised hand. "You're overcomplicating existing workflows. That's a classic junior mistake. Trying to reinvent things you don't fully understand." "Junior?" The word burned more than it should have. I had been with the company for years, proven myself repeatedly. "I do understand them," I said, keeping my tone even. "That's why I saw the repetition and the loss points. This isn't reinvention, it's optimization." His smile tightened, no warmth behind it. "Optimization is a buzzword people use when they don't have practical insight. You've stacked reports on top of reports and convinced yourself you found something new." I felt heat rise to my face, but I refused to let it show. With respect, I validated this across multiple data sets. The savings alone. "Enough," he said sharply, leaning forward now. "This is not ready. It's messy. Amateur, frankly. I'd advise you to stick to executing what's assigned instead of chasing ideas beyond your scope." For a moment I couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I searched his face for some sign that this was a test, or provocation, or rough mentorship. There was nothing. Just dismissal. "I see," I said finally, though I didn't. I stood, hands steady despite the noise roaring behind my ribs. "Thank you for your time." As I walked out, I was painfully aware of the way humiliation settles. Not all at once, but in layers. Each step down the corridor replayed his words, trying to lodge them somewhere permanent. I resisted the urge to shrink, to erase myself. By the time I reached my desk, my confidence was bruised but not broken. Something felt wrong. Not wounded pride, something colder, more precise. The idea hadn't been weak. His reaction hadn't been critique. It had been contempt. And contempt, I knew, was rarely honest. The shift was subtle enough that I almost missed it. If I hadn't been replaying the previous day in my mind with surgical precision, if I hadn't been alert to every irregularity, I might have dismissed it as coincidence. But something was different the moment I stepped into the office that morning, and my body sensed it before my mind gave it a name. He greeted me, not warmly, not openly, but with a nod and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was polite, measured, uncharacteristic. The man who had waved me out of his office with barely concealed disdain the day before now paused in the hallway to say, "Morning," as if testing the word. I replied automatically and kept walking, my thoughts already racing ahead of my steps. At my desk, I logged in and opened my calendar. A new entry caught my attention immediately. Strategic Direction Presentation, all hands. It had been added overnight. No description, no prep notes, just a time and a room. My stomach tightened, though I couldn't yet justify why. Strategic presentations didn't appear without reason, and they certainly didn't materialize that quickly. Throughout the morning, his door stayed closed. That alone wasn't unusual, but the quiet intensity behind it was. I heard his voice through the glass once or twice, low and controlled, punctuated by pauses that suggested listening rather than speaking. Phone calls, long ones. I watched shadows move behind the frosted glass, the outline of his hand lifting, gesturing, emphasizing points I couldn't hear. Whatever was happening in there, it had his full attention. Emails began circulating, requests for data, confirmations, schedules. I recognized the phrasing in one of them, a specific term I had used in my document, not common in our internal vocabulary. My cursor hovered over the screen as I reread it, my pulse quickening. It could mean nothing, I told myself. Or it could mean everything. I tried to focus on my tasks, but concentration slipped through my fingers. Every sound pulled at me. The click of keys, the muted laughter from the break area, the hum of the printer. I became aware of how little transparency existed beneath the illusion of openness we worked in. Ideas flowed upward, decisions came down, and somewhere in between, things disappeared. By early afternoon, my doubt had sharpened into something more active. I opened my files again, the original document, the saved versions, the timestamps. Yesterday evening. Late. Untouched since. A quiet record of effort I suddenly felt compelled to protect. I backed everything up twice, labeling folders with dates, making trails even I didn't fully understand yet why I needed. When he finally emerged from his office, he looked energized, focused, purposeful in a way I hadn't seen before. He moved through the space with confidence, stopping briefly to speak to people, his tone lighter, almost genial. When he passed my desk, he paused. "Big meeting tomorrow," he said casually. "Yes," I replied. "I saw the invite." "Good," he nodded. "Should be interesting." The word lingered long after he walked away. By the end of the day, suspicion had settled in my chest like a quiet weight. Nothing concrete. Nothing I could accuse or name. Just a growing awareness that the idea I had carried into his office yesterday had not died there. It had gone somewhere else. And whatever shape it was taking now, I was no longer certain I was part of it. As I shut down my computer, I realized something with unsettling clarity. This was no longer about recognition or ambition. It was about ownership. And the meeting on my calendar wasn't just a presentation. It was a reveal. The room is already half full when I walk in, and that alone sharpens my unease. People rarely arrive early unless they expect something important or impressive. The long table gleams under the ceiling lights, chairs neatly aligned, water glasses untouched. At the far end, the projector hums softly, awake and ready. I take a seat near the side, setting my notebook down without opening it. My hands feel steady, but there is a thin tension running through my arms, like a wire pulled too tight. He enters last. The conversation dies almost instantly, replaced by an expectant silence. He stands at the head of the table, relaxed, confident, carrying himself as if the room belongs to him twice over. There is no trace of yesterday's dismissal on his face. If anything, he looks pleased, energized. He doesn't look at me when he starts speaking. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he says smoothly. "I wanted to share a strategic insight that came together recently. One of those moments where the data finally clicks." My breath slows. Clicks. The word echoes unpleasantly in my head. The first slide appears. At first, it's abstract enough that I can pretend. General framing. Familiar context. But then he begins to explain the problem, and my spine straightens despite myself. The structure, the order in which he presents the inefficiencies, is unmistakable. Not generic, not accidental. It's the same path I followed, the same logic I used to lead one issue into another. I tell myself to wait, to stay calm. Coincidences exist. The second slide erases that comfort. A graph appears, the axis labeled in exactly the same way I labeled mine. Even the phrasing of the headline mirrors my own, stripped of my voice but carrying its bones. I glance around the table. Heads nod. Pens move. Interest sharpens. He explains how redundant approvals create artificial delays, how those delays force emergency spending. The words are different, slightly polished, but the sequence, the argument, is mine. My mouth feels dry. Slide by slide, the realization settles into place, heavy and undeniable. My document lives on that screen. Not copied pixel for pixel, but translated, cleaned, refined, presented as something born whole in his mind. The cost projections appear next. The numbers are not exact, but they are close enough to make my chest tighten. Close enough to prove origin without saying it out loud. A quiet buzzing fills my ears, like pressure building at altitude. He speaks about advantages now, about competitive edge, about savings. The room is engaged, leaning forward. Someone lets out a low whistle at a particularly favorable projection. He smiles at that modestly, as though surprised by his own brilliance. "This," he says, gesturing at the screen, "is how we move forward instead of staying stuck in legacy thinking." Legacy thinking. Yesterday, the same ideas were amateur. Today, they are visionary. I sit perfectly still, afraid that if I move, something inside me will crack audibly. My reflection stares back at me from the black edge of the screen, composed, unreadable, distant. No one looks at me. No one knows. Or if they do, they give no sign. When the presentation ends, there is a brief pause, and then applause. Soft at first, then real. Not thunderous, but sincere. He nods, accepting it with practiced humility. "Great work," someone says. "Yes, impressive," another adds. He thanks them, already shifting into questions and next steps. And then, as if remembering an afterthought, he turns in my direction. "I'd be curious to hear your thoughts," he says. "You work closely with these processes." The room pivots with him. Eyes land on me, expectant, neutral, unaware they are looking at a fault line. My heart doesn't race. That surprises me. Instead, everything slows. In that stretched moment, I understand something with painful clarity. This isn't confusion. It isn't misunderstanding. It's deliberate, clean, calculated. And the silence he has invited me into is not accidental. It's a test. And whatever I say next will decide who leaves this room unchanged and who doesn't. The room waits. Not dramatically, not impatiently, but with the quiet weight of expectation that presses in from all sides. Dozens of small cues flood my awareness. The way someone shifts in their chair, the pause of a pen mid-note, the faint hum of the projector still warm with borrowed brilliance. My name hangs invisibly between us, wrapped inside my boss's polite request. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, as if curiosity were the point. Years of conditioning rise up instantly, reflexive and powerful. Don't rock the boat. Choose survival over truth. Authority knows best. I've learned these lessons well, absorbed them through meetings and reviews, and carefully phrased feedback that always circled the same message. People like you advance by being useful, not visible, by supporting, not challenging, by staying in your lane. I feel that training tug at me now, urging silence, a safe silence. I could nod. I could offer a neutral observation. Praise the clarity of the presentation. Ask a question that adds nothing. No one would blame me. No one would accuse me. The meeting would move on, and this moment, this sharp, dangerous edge, would pass. But something has already broken. I am acutely aware of my breathing, slow and deliberate. My hands rest folded on the table, still obedient to me, though my pulse beats firmly in my throat. I glance briefly at my boss. He wears an expression of calm authority, faintly encouraging, like a teacher offering a struggling student one final chance to cooperate. There is no fear in his eyes, no doubt. He believes this is over. Yesterday's words surface uninvited, messy, amateur, beyond your scope. They don't sting the way they did before. Now they settle into place, aligning with everything else. They weren't judgment. They were preparation. He hadn't dismissed the idea because it was weak. He had dismissed me because I was inconvenient. The realization brings a strange clarity. Silence would not protect me. It would complete the theft. If I say nothing, this version of events becomes official, documented, applauded, repeated. My work will exist without my name attached to it, stripped of origin, absorbed into his narrative. And I will carry the knowledge quietly, reshaping myself around it until resentment hardens into something permanent. I look around the table again, not to seek allies, but witnesses. These are people I work with every day, people who respect competence, who believe in data, who think fairness is real even if they don't always see it enforced. They are not cruel. They are simply unaware. And right now, they are watching me decide who I am. My boss tilts his head slightly, patient now, expecting compliance. For the first time, the risk doesn't feel abstract. I understand exactly what speaking up could cost me. Reputation, stability, perhaps my job. But staying silent suddenly feels more expensive. It would cost me something internal and non-negotiable. Trust in myself. I draw in a breath, steady and quiet. Not yet. I am not ready to speak, not because I lack courage, but because timing matters. Silence, I realize, can also be a tool. A pause long enough to unsettle, long enough to make the room lean in rather than move on. So I hold it. A few seconds pass, just enough to stretch the moment, to let uncertainty brush against the edges of his confidence. Someone clears their throat. Another person looks from him to me, sensing tension without understanding it. Finally, I lift my gaze and meet his eyes. I do have thoughts, I say evenly. Not an accusation, not a defense, just a statement of fact. Something flickers across his expression, too quick to name but real. The room grows even quieter. I can feel the pivot point beneath my feet now, solid and irreversible. The silence has ended, and what comes next will not be small. I stand slowly, giving myself an extra second to feel the floor beneath my feet. Stillness has always been my strength. I don't raise my voice. I don't rush. When I speak, it's with the same calm I use to explain data discrepancies or correct flawed assumptions. Measured, precise, impossible to dismiss as emotional. I'd like to ask a clarifying question, I begin, my eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to him. When was this idea first developed? The phrasing is deliberate, neutral, professional. No accusation yet, just a request for context. A pause, barely noticeable, but there. He smiles. Recently, he says. Over the last few days? I nod as if mentally noting the answer. That's interesting, I reply, because I presented a concept with the same structure, logic, and core conclusions in your office yesterday afternoon. The air changes immediately. Chairs creak. Someone inhales sharply. I don't look away. My heart is steady now, grounded in something unmistakably solid. Truth has weight. I can feel it anchoring me as I continue. At 6:47 p.m., to be exact, I add, I can provide the file timestamps if needed. The original draft and subsequent revisions are saved on my system, with backups. I don't gesture. I don't dramatize. I simply state facts. He laughs. Not fully, not comfortably. I think we're conflating things here, he says quickly. Ideas circulate. People collaborate. This isn't collaboration, I say, gently interrupting him. My tone remains respectful, but firm. There was no feedback, no revision discussion, no joint development. The idea was dismissed. That lands harder than I expect. A ripple travels through the room, subtle but real. I can see it in their eyes now. Recognition. The shift from confusion to understanding. They're reconstructing timelines, replaying yesterday through today. I open my tablet and project a single screen, clean, unembellished. A document header, my name, the date, the metadata panel visible to anyone willing to read it. This isn't about credit, I continue. It's about accuracy. If we're going to move forward with this strategy, it should be acknowledged where it came from, because integrity matters, especially at this level. Silence returns, but this time, it's not heavy. It's sharp. He doesn't look at me now. His jaw tightens, just perceptibly. The confident posture he wore minutes ago starts to fracture at the edges. I sit back down slowly, having said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. The first strike is done. And for the first time since the meeting began, I'm not the one holding my breath. The silence stretches, but it no longer belongs to him. I can feel it shifting awareness around the room, rewiring assumptions in real time. People aren't looking at the screen anymore. They're looking at us, at the space between what was just revealed and what it implies. No one reaches for their phone. No one interrupts. This isn't spectacle. It's recognition. My boss straightens, too sharply, as if posture alone could reassert control. Let's be careful here, he says, voice tightened by forced restraint. You're turning a productive discussion into something personal. I don't respond immediately. I let the words sit, let everyone measure them against the facts still glowing on the screen. Then I speak, not louder, not faster, but clearer. It became personal when my work was publicly presented after being privately dismissed, I say. Yesterday, this idea was described to me as unfocused and amateur. Today, it's being praised as strategic and forward-thinking. Those two things cannot coexist without explanation. A murmur moves through the room now, small, involuntary reactions. Someone shifts forward, another crosses their arms more tightly. I'm not speculating anymore. I'm outlining a contradiction, and contradictions demand resolution. He exhales visibly, irritation breaking through his facade. "You're implying misconduct," he snaps. "That's a serious accusation." "I'm naming what occurred," I reply steadily. "Intellectual theft isn't softened by hierarchy, and respect doesn't require silence." That lands. The word theft doesn't explode. It settles. Heavy. Precise. Impossible to ignore. I can almost see people recalibrating their understanding of authority in front of me, dismantling the unspoken rule that seniority grants ownership of everything beneath it. He opens his mouth to respond, then closes it again. Whatever he had prepared clearly wasn't designed for resistance this measured. His confidence begins to unravel, not dramatically, but visibly. He rubs his jaw, eyes flicking away, searching for something that will put the pieces back where they were 10 minutes ago. But they won't go back. "This is inappropriate," he says louder now. "If there's an issue, it should be handled privately." "It was handled privately," I respond, and dismissed. No anger in my voice, no satisfaction either, just finality. The projector hums quietly, still displaying proof that no longer needs defending. I realize something in that moment. This is bigger than me now. The room knows it. He knows it. The narrative has slipped from his hands. I glance around the table one last time. No challenge, no outrage, just understanding, and that quiet, dangerous thing that follows it: judgment. My boss leans back in his chair, breathing harder than before. Control has abandoned him, and he knows it. The exposure is complete, not because I raised my voice or forced a reaction, but because truth, once spoken plainly, leaves no room for performance. And whatever happens next, his authority will never sound the same again. He reacts the way people do when they realize they are losing power, not with reasoning, but with accusation. "This is sabotage," he says abruptly, leaning forward again as if momentum alone can reclaim control. Publicly undermining leadership, questioning authority in front of the team, this is insubordination. There it is. The familiar shield. Not untrue, not incorrect, but disrespectful. The charge people reach for when facts refuse to bend. I feel the word ripple through the room, testing loyalties, probing old instincts. For a brief moment, the old system tries to reassert itself. I don't flinch. "If telling the truth disrupts authority," I say calmly, "then the authority was already unstable." A few heads lift sharply. He freezes, just for a second, caught off guard by how quietly the words arrive. I can tell he's recalculating, framing the situation in terms that still serve him. He needs this to be about behavior, not substance, about tone, not content. "You're emotional," he says, pointing vaguely in my direction. This is exactly why junior staff shouldn't overstep their roles. I feel something cold settle behind my ribs, not anger, but clarity. "This isn't emotion," I reply. "It's documentation. And I didn't overstep. I was asked to speak." That last part matters. I let it hang there, undeniable. He did invite this. He assumed compliance. He miscalculated. The room has changed sides, not dramatically, not openly, but unmistakably. People aren't aligning with me. They're aligning with coherence, with consistency, with the notion that effort should correspond to credit. One person clears their throat. "She's right about the timestamps," someone says quietly from across the table. "I've seen similar metadata pulled before. It's reliable." Another voice follows, hesitant but firm. "And I do remember her asking for time with you yesterday." The effect is cumulative, not a rebellion, something more dangerous. Confirmation. My boss's face tightens. His hands curl into fists, then relax again. He laughs, sharp and humorless. "So now we're doing this," he says. "A pile on?" "No one is piling on," I respond. "They're contributing context, the same way I tried to." He glares at me, and for the first time I see it clearly. Not authority, not confidence, but fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequence. Fear of a narrative he cannot fully control anymore. "This meeting is over," he says abruptly. "We'll address this offline." "With respect," I reply evenly. "That won't be sufficient." The sentence lands like a door locking. "This involves ownership, ethics, and attribution," I continue. "If we're going to proceed with this project, the process behind it needs to be transparent. For everyone." Silence returns one last time, but now it's different again. Not sharp, not heavy, resolute. He looks around the table, searching for allies who aren't there. What stares back at him isn't hostility, it's expectation. Accountability, perhaps for the first time in his tenure. He leans back slowly, exhaling through his nose. The fight has drained out of him, replaced by something brittle and exposed. He nods once, curtly. "Fine," he mutters. "HR can sort it out." There it is. The retreat disguised as procedure. As the meeting adjourns in stiff, awkward movements, people avoid his eyes. But not mine. I don't smile. I don't speak. I simply gather my things, aware that something fundamental has shifted. This was his defense, and it failed. Not because I defeated him, but because it was never built on truth to begin with. HR doesn't arrive like a storm. There's no drama, no raised voices, no instant justice. It comes quietly, through calendar invites and neutral subject lines, through polite requests to walk us through the timeline. And somehow, that makes it more unnerving. There's nowhere to perform, nowhere to intimidate, only facts. I sit in a small conference room 2 days later, white walls, glass table, a carafe of water untouched between us. Across from me are 2 HR representatives and someone from compliance. My boss is late. That detail doesn't go unnoticed, though no one comments on it. They ask me to speak first. I do. Not emotionally, not defensively. I explain the sequence exactly as it happened. The late evening, the document creation, the meeting in his office, his dismissal, the presentation. I provide files, metadata, email trails. Everything aligns. Every answer leads cleanly into the next question, as if the story has already decided how it wants to be told. When he finally enters, his presence feels smaller than it used to. He avoids looking at me, choosing a seat angled away, arms crossed tightly. When it's his turn, his version of events is unfocused. He speaks in generalities, about shared thinking, about strategic overlap, about how ideas evolve organically at senior levels. No documents support that evolution. HR listens, takes notes, asks follow-ups he can't fully answer. The dynamic is unmistakable now. This isn't about hierarchy. It's about credibility. And for the first time, his isn't winning. Over the next week, the office adjusts around the uncertainty. Conversations lower when he walks by. Meetings happen without him. People come to me, not overtly, not conspiratorially, but with respect, asking clarifying questions, looping me into discussions I was never part of before. It's subtle, but profound. Authority has shifted, not announced, but understood. Then comes the email, a brief notice about organizational changes and an interim reporting adjustment. My boss is stepping back from project leadership by mutual agreement, while an internal review concludes. In the same message, I'm asked to temporarily oversee the strategic initiative. I stare at the screen longer than necessary. This isn't triumph. It's consequence. When I walk into my first meeting as lead, the room feels different. Not because I demand it, but because no one doubts why I'm there. The idea is mine again, openly now, but more importantly, my voice carries weight it didn't before. Earned, not granted. As the discussion begins, I understand with quiet certainty. There is no returning to who I was before this. No shrinking back. No unseeing what I now know I can do. The turning point has passed. And I don't feel afraid. I feel clear. The official announcement comes on a Friday afternoon, wrapped in language so careful it almost feels rehearsed beyond sincerity. My former boss is leaving the company by mutual agreement to pursue other opportunities. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the rupture he leaves behind. Just a clean sentence designed to let everyone move forward without saying what we all already know. I read it twice, then close the email. There is no surge of victory, no desire to forward it, to mark the moment. What I feel instead is a quiet release, like pressure easing from a place I hadn't realized was constantly braced. The story is finished now, not with a dramatic end, but with alignment. Cause and consequence finally touching hands. By Monday, the office has normalized the change. People adapt quickly when uncertainty is resolved. Titles update. Calendars shift. I am formally offered leadership of the project, not as a gesture of apology, but as confirmation. The meeting is brief, direct, respectful. We'd like you to take this forward, they tell me. You understand it better than anyone. I accept without hesitation. The work itself is familiar, grounding. Implementation meetings replace speculation. Data replaces narrative. Every improvement we roll out validates the original idea, not emotionally, but operationally. Costs drop. Delays shorten. Results speak with the fluency that arguments never quite have. I don't over-explain. I don't perform leadership. I listen, decide, move. What surprises me most is how others respond. Not with awe, not with resentment, but with trust. The kind that assumes competence and expects consistency. People challenge me openly. They disagree without fear. They don't whisper. That more than anything tells me I've done something right. Occasionally, someone brings up my former boss in passing, cautiously, as if testing the emotional terrain. I don't engage. Not out of bitterness, but because he's irrelevant now. He isn't a villain in my memory, just a lesson I no longer need to revisit. One evening, long after most people have gone home, I sit alone in the same office area where this all began. Different night, same quiet hum. I open the original file, the first draft, untouched since that late evening. The metadata still there, the proof no longer necessary. I don't feel tempted to delete it. Instead, I save a copy elsewhere and close the document gently, like setting down something that has served its purpose. Confidence no longer feels fragile or rare. It feels integrated, ordinary, mine. As I shut down my computer and turn off the lights, I realize the victory was never about exposure or recognition. It was about choosing not to disappear when silence was offered as safety. I walk out knowing this clarity will stay with me, earned, unforced, and permanent. And for the first time, the future doesn't feel like something to be negotiated. It feels like something I can stand inside, fully visible, without fear.